Why did Buddha allow the consumption of meat? Welcome back, everyone, to Mind Podcast. Before starting the video, I want to ask you a question. Do you think Buddhism prohibits monks from eating meat? Many viewers may assume that, of course, Buddhism forbids the consumption of meat and prioritizes vegetarianism. However, the reality is not that straightforward. Only the monks of Chinese Buddhism are strictly prohibited from eating meat. In contrast, Tibetan lamas, Theravada Buddhist monks in Asia, and even monks in India, the birthplace of Buddhism, are permitted to eat meat. In Japan, monks can even marry and have children. So what is the reason behind this? And is it truly justified? Let's explore this in today's video. According to Theravada Buddhism, whether or not one practices vegetarianism depends entirely on the individual's choice. They believe that Buddhism does not emphasize the purity and sanctity of food, but rather the purity and sanctity of the mind. This issue is often fiercely debated, primarily by those following Mahayana Buddhism, which advocates for vegetarianism, and by those who discuss Buddhism based on the precept of non-harming, ahimsa. We need to understand that Theravada Buddhism, also known as the Southern School, still follows the practice of almsgiving, receiving food offerings, just as it was during the time of Buddha Shakyamuni. Buddhism encourages monks to renounce all worldly attachments. Once you become a monk, you must give up the pursuit of making a living. It is only by doing this that one can fully focus on practicing and attaining enlightenment. Monks do not engage in labor or production, but still need to eat to maintain daily energy. Therefore, the only way to live is through almsgiving, or in other words, begging for food. This is also a form of ethical practice followed by various schools of thought in India at the time. They believed that by giving alms to monks, people could form good karmic connections with all beings and foster a bond with the Buddha. There is an opportunity to perform acts of giving, almsgiving, to accumulate merit, which is why most people see Theravada Buddhist monks practicing almsgiving. When monks practice almsgiving for food, they are not allowed to request specific types of food from those offering, as one might do in a restaurant. Therefore, from the time of the Buddha until today, this tradition has maintained the practice of receiving whatever is offered. Secondly, Theravada Buddhism supports vegetarianism in a specific form known as threefold pure meat. This means there are 3 types of meat that monks are permitted to eat. First, meat from an animal they did not see being killed. Second, meat from an animal whose cries they did not hear during slaughter. And third, meat from an animal that they have no reason to believe was killed specifically for them. Monks who consume food under these conditions are not violating the precept of non-harming. This was established by the Buddha and is recorded in the Vinaya, monastic rules. It is said that while the Buddha was preaching, a monk named Devadatta proposed to the Buddha that all monks should be strictly vegetarian, prohibiting the consumption of any meat or fish. The Buddha straightforwardly rejected this proposal. The Buddha likely had practical reasons and took into account the social circumstances of the time. For example, vegetables were not abundantly cultivated in the northern regions of India in ancient times, especially during dry seasons when crops like vegetables and grains were scarce. Later on, in regions like Tibet, where livestock was plentiful but vegetables and fruits were nearly non-existent, strict vegetarianism would have posed significant challenges. This shows how far-sighted the Buddha was, able to foresee the future needs of humanity. From the Buddha's time until today, Theravada Buddhist monks have continued to live by almsgiving, receiving food based on the generosity and offerings of lay followers. If monks were to require only vegetarian food, it could unintentionally burden the lay people who provide them with daily meals. In reality, the majority of people in these regions take time each day to prepare food for offering to the monks, and only afterward do they cook for their own families. Most of these Buddhist families also follow a meat-inclusive diet, as has been the tradition since the time of the Buddha. Thus, Theravada monks accept and eat whatever is offered to them, including meat, as long as it falls within the threefold pure meat guidelines, as mentioned earlier. Regarding the monastic code, Theravada Buddhism prohibits monks from receiving alms in the form of money. As a result, they cannot buy food or choose what they eat. Even if they wish to be vegetarian, they are entirely dependent on the alms offered to them by villagers or lay followers. Even when meals are prepared in the monastery, the ingredients used are those donated daily by the lay people. In contrast, Mahayana Buddhism, especially in China, does not accept this form of eating. They believe that a strict vegetarian diet is necessary, and monks should abstain entirely from meat and fish, consuming only vegetables, fruits, and beans. Why is there such difference between Theravada and Mahayana Buddhism? This difference can be traced back to an emperor from ancient China named Xiaoyan, also known as Emperor Wu of Lian, who ruled during the Southern Dynasties period. Emperor Wu was a devout Buddhist who contributed significantly to the spread of Buddhism. During his reign, he built hundreds of temples to promote the religion. Moreover, Emperor Wu himself renounced the throne 3 times to become a monk, dedicating himself to chanting and reciting Buddhist scriptures to seek blessings for his people. Emperor Wu was a devout follower who is said to have read almost every Buddhist scripture. His favorite was the Shorangama Sutra, in which the Buddha teaches that those seeking true concentration, samadhi, should aim to transcend worldly attachments. If the mind of killing is not eradicated, one cannot escape suffering, even if they possess great concentration and meditative power. If one doesn't fully renounce the intent to kill, they are destined to fall into the realm of ghosts and spirits. Those at the highest level will become powerful demons. Those at the middle level will become flying spirits or ghost wolves. And those at the lowest level will become earthbound spirits. Among these demons, there are some who, in the past, were on the path to supreme enlightenment. But after my passing, during the age of decline, these ghostly beings will spread throughout the world. Not only does eating meat prevent one from attaining enlightenment, but it also leads to rebirth as lower beings. You should know that those who eat meat may seem to have reached some level of enlightenment, but they are still of the nature of killing. Once their merit is exhausted, they will inevitably fall into the sea of suffering. They are not true disciples of the Buddha. Such people harm and consume one another, perpetuating the cycle of killing and consumption, making it impossible to escape from the cycle of reincarnation. This is why Emperor Wu of Lian advocated for the complete removal of meat and alcohol from his imperial court. His ideals had a profound and lasting influence on Chinese society, and they greatly persuaded Mahayana Buddhist monks to prohibit meat consumption and alcohol even today. In my personal opinion, whether one follows Theravada or Mahayana Buddhism, the purpose of vegetarianism is to cultivate compassion, reduce anger, and observe the precept of non-harming. It encourages us to value the lives of all beings. When one possesses compassion, they naturally cannot bear to kill. Many people reflect on the cruelty involved in killing animals and have abandoned their desire for meat and fish, choosing instead to become vegetarians. This view is not limited to Buddhists. Many people in the West and from other religions around the world are adopting vegetarianism because of this belief in compassion. For lay Buddhists, it is important to reflect and decide for themselves what is right or wrong, what is ethical, and what aligns with the Buddha's teachings. Since this issue is understood and practiced differently by various Buddhist schools, you should study further and determine a way of eating that avoids contributing to harmful and unwholesome thoughts or actions that promote killing. In summary, according to the Theravada Buddhist perspective, you can choose to be vegetarian, or, if vegetarianism is financially or practically difficult, you may continue to consume meat without holding the intention to kill or contribute to killing, while still maintaining virtuous Buddhist conduct. From the Mahayana Buddhist viewpoint, ordained monks are strictly required to follow a vegetarian diet consisting of vegetables, plants, and fruits. For lay Buddhists, if they are able to maintain a vegetarian diet for their health and convenience, it is highly commendable. If not, lay practitioners are encouraged to observe vegetarianism on specific days, such as the 1st and 15th days of the lunar month, or during significant festivals, to cultivate compassion toward all beings. However, it is important not to assume that simply being vegetarian automatically makes one a good Buddhist. In Buddhism, vegetarianism cannot substitute for other forms of practice, such as following moral precepts and ethical conduct, as mentioned earlier. Buddhism emphasizes living according to the precepts and practicing mindfulness to purify the mind, which is what truly generates good karma and blessings. For instance, there are many people who are lifelong vegetarians, but when it comes to personal benefits or challenges, they can still become angry and engage in negative thoughts and actions against others. An example is of a vegetarian who, in a fit of anger, killed a dog that bit their young child. Meat-eating Buddhists often argue that even the Buddha himself ate meat when it was offered to him by others, yet he attained enlightenment. This suggests that vegetarianism is not the sole path to spiritual progress. When we consume meat, we are indirectly responsible for the death of an animal. However, even as vegetarians, we may still contribute to harm in other ways. For example, farmers tilling the land disturb ecosystems, impacting insects and small animals. They also use pesticides which kill many insects to grow the crops that vegetarians consume. Many animals and insects rely on plants as their habitat, and cultivating crops for human consumption also affects their survival. Ultimately, vegetarianism is often chosen because plants are perceived as less sentient than animals, but the broader impact on ecosystems should also be considered. But is it accurate to say that plants communicate in their own way? They require water and sunlight to survive, their seeds are alive, and their flowers are their means of reproduction. The Buddha taught that there are millions of living beings in a single glass of water. So why do vegetarians drink it? Do these microorganisms enjoy living inside our bodies? Of course, they do not. We impose such conditions because we need to survive. According to the Buddhist teachings, both vegetarians and meat eaters can reach a state of purity. The key lies in the quality of the mind, not in one's diet. Many Buddhists are deeply concerned about not eating meat, but they do not pay as much attention to changing their selfish, dishonest, cruel, or envious habits. Changing one's diet is easy, but changing the mind is much harder. Whether you are vegetarian or not, remember that purifying the mind and attaining a state of inner stillness, unaffected by external circumstances, is the most important aspect of Buddhism. This modern interpretation of Buddhism can be seen clearly in Japan, known as the land of the rising sun. Japan exhibits many unique and unusual characteristics, such as the fact that Buddhist monks there are free to eat meat, drink alcohol, marry, and have children, just like ordinary people. We are accustomed to thinking that those who have renounced the world have left behind worldly desires to purify their minds. Monks typically embrace a lifestyle of vegetarianism, recite the Buddha's teachings, and abandon all worldly ambitions, including starting a family, to fully dedicate themselves to spiritual practice. However, in Japan, things are different. Buddhist monks there lead a more worldly life, engaging in activities like eating meat, drinking alcohol, getting married, and having children, practices that stand in contrast to what is traditionally expected of monastic life elsewhere. This phenomenon surprises many Buddhists and those knowledgeable about Buddhism worldwide, finding it both unexpected and intriguing. For international visitors, it may seem unusual, but for professionals, it's considered a norm. So, why are Japanese monks allowed to marry, eat meat, and drink alcohol? Here's the explanation for this unique phenomenon. In the history of Japan, monks have been allowed to marry since the Heian period, and this practice continued through the Kamakura, Muromachi, and Edo periods, eventually becoming a tradition that persists to this day. In Japan and other East Asian countries, various Buddhist sects emerged, each with its own rules, practices, approaches, and interpretations. Some of the major Buddhist sects in Japan include Zen, Pure Land, and Nichiren. Later on, other groups such as Soka Gakkai and Nipponzan Myohoji were also established. Essentially, monks are not strictly required to remain celibate for life. While some monks in these sects choose to live solitary lives, others return to worldly life, marrying and having children. The decision to marry is left to the individual monk based on their own free will, while they still maintain their responsibilities to Buddhism. This tradition stems from the Meiji Restoration era. In 1868, the Meiji Restoration marked the end of the Tokugawa shogunate's 800-year rule and the beginning of the Meiji era, under the power of the emperor. This was a turning point for Japan, as the country opened up to the world and embarked on modernization. As part of this shift, anything related to the shogunate was dismantled or abolished, including certain aspects of Buddhism. Before the Meiji Revolution, from 1866 to 1869, Shinto and Buddhism were merged into a system called Shinbutsu Shugo. However, after Emperor Meiji came into power, Shinto was separated from Buddhism. Emperor Meiji, as a descendant of the Shinto deity Kami, distanced the nation from Buddhism, which had been supported by the shogunate. This resulted in the establishment of policies such as Haibutsu Kishaku, abolishing Buddhism and destroying Buddhist temples and statues, further cementing changes to the religious landscape of Japan. This event led to the destruction of temples, Buddhist images, and records, forcing many Buddhist monks to return to secular life. If you have watched our video on the decline of the Dharma, I believe this serves as a clear example. In 1872, the Meiji government issued the Nikkojiku Saitai law, which allowed Buddhist monks to freely marry, eat meat, and drink alcohol, effectively normalizing their lives. This was seen as a way for the government to weaken Buddhism. While some monks chose to remain celibate, the majority adopted this change, and many Buddhist sects in Japan later followed a hereditary system. This meant that after a temple abbot passed away, his successor would typically be his son. A notable example is Shinran Shonin, born in 1173 and passing away in 1263, the founder of the Jodo Shinshu, True Pure Land sect of Japanese Buddhism. Shinran publicly married and had 7 children. His descendants continued to maintain and expand the sect's influence. Even today in Japan, there are matchmaking events for monks. Monks are seen as ideal marriage partners by Japanese women, as they are considered intellectuals, often with high incomes, permitted to run businesses, own their own homes, and are regarded as trustworthy, rarely engaging in extramarital affairs. These explanations help unravel the mystery of the private lives of Japanese monks. In Japan, the choice of whether to remain single or marry is left to the individual. As long as practitioners keep their hearts focused on the Buddha, that is considered sufficient. As Shinran, the founder of the Jodo Shinshu sect, is quoted as saying, "If expressing your faith in the Buddha is easier alone, then remain single. But if it is easier to do so with a spouse, then it is better to marry." This flexible perspective reflects the modern approach to Buddhism in Japan, where the focus remains on inner faith rather than strict adherence to monastic celibacy. The key point is how we express our faith in chanting and dedicating ourselves to the Buddha. What do you think about this perspective of Japanese Buddhism? Feel free to share your thoughts in the comment section below. An interesting fact is that a monk can even combine Buddhism with music to convey messages in a more engaging way. For example, a Japanese monk went viral for singing Buddhist mantras in a rock style. This monk, Kankyo Yakushiji, recently gained online fame for his rock rendition of the Heart Sutra and the Great Compassion Mantra. Born in 1974 in Imabari, a city in Ehime Prefecture, Japan, his father was the abbot of Kaizenji Temple. In many Buddhist sects in Japan, the tradition of hereditary succession is common, meaning that after an abbot passes away, his son usually succeeds him. Therefore, Kankyo Yakushiji was raised from a young age to become a monk. As a child, Kankyo loved rock music, and at 20, he rebelled against his family's tradition and formed his own band to pursue his artistic dreams. "Music was my escape," he said. His early songs had a pop or folk influence and were mainly about family, friends, and his hometown. At 27, his band signed with a major record label. However, transitioning from being independent musicians to working in a professional environment left the band feeling lost. They no longer knew what message they wanted to convey and gradually lost their passion for singing.